Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I rise today to speak on the government measures to improve housing tax integrity, the Treasury Laws Amendment Housing Tax Integrity Bill of 2017 and the Foreign Acquisitions and Takeovers Fees Imposition Amendment Vacancy Fees Bill of 2017. The Turnbull Coalition Government is committed to improving housing affordability for all Australians and ensuring that investors, both from Australia and from abroad, cannot abuse our tax system and claim tax deductions that are inappropriate or invalid. Indeed, Acting Deputy President, this bill goes to the core of the government's budget announcements, highlighting our commitment to reduce pressure on housing affordability. Acting Deputy President, the Turnbull Coalition Government is committed to ensuring that all Australians have an opportunity to own an Australian home and that these measures are designed to make that more accessible. As many senators in this chamber and those members in the other place have said before, Acting Deputy President, there is something uniquely Australian about the idea and the ideal of home ownership. And this is by no means a 21st century phenomenon. Considering the Australian housing affordability crisis is part of the lexicon of commentators and of academics and of politicians, I think it's worth bearing in mind the historical context of how we reached this place. And you may be interested to know that I read recently something suggesting that the origins of Australians' obsession for home ownership began at the turn of the 20th century, when Australian houses not just housed people, but they also fed them. While other countries would place their farmland just outside of town centres, Australians grew their food in their backyards, and so saw the rise of the quarter-acre block, a truly Australian phenomenon. This was very significant during wartime, in particular, when there was rationing. But the post-war brought with it a new challenge, and that was the scourge of communism. Now, during the Cold War, home ownership was actually seen as a way to quell revolutionary tendencies. People with mortgages tend not to, with jobs, with families and with responsibilities, they tend not to be the types of people that want to storm the Winter Palace. And then as the waves of new post-war migrants came to Australia, they saw home ownership as an opportunity that wasn't available in Britain, that wasn't available in Europe. So by the mid-1970s in Australia, home ownership had reached a high point of around 70 to 75%. Now, financial deregulation in the 1980s changed things up again. It saw a levelling of the playing field between owner-occupiers and investors, around whom, and of course the system had been geared around those owner-occupiers. And then with the burn of that 17% interest rates and the recession we had to have in the early 90s, with that seared on people's brains and in their bank balances in particular, and only a nascent compulsory retirement system, saving system at that stage, the moment property market started to rise faster than inflation, investors came back into the market, attracted by the idea of being landlords. So housing moved beyond becoming sort of a democratic ideal. Its value then became seen in dollars as well as in dreams. So these were the sort of seismic shifts that we've seen in the Australian housing market that have brought us to where we are today. And home ownership is still very much part of the Australian dream, and the Turnbull government recognises this and recognises that there is a part for the government to play in assisting Australians to realise this dream. Now, Acting Deputy President, I hate to ever admit that Senator Whish-Wilson is right about anything, but this time he in fact is. The measures detailed in this bill at hand are only one small part of the solution, but they are a very important part. They form a very important part of a greater suite of policy measures designed to ease the burden of housing affordability. But these measures also reinforce the Turnbull Coalition Government's commitment to removing significant abuses of the tax system. And there are three significant measures in this bill, in both of these bills, that for the benefit of the chamber I'd like to examine in more detail. Acting Deputy President, while no one on my side of politics would deny the right of businesses and individuals to legitimately claim expenses incurred on their tax return, it is always incumbent upon the government to ensure that the tax code adequately reflects a reasonable and legitimate degree to which these deductions are accessed. An appropriate use of tax deductions inappropriate use of tax deductions are essentially tantamount to stealing from the public purse. And we've said many, many times in this place that this is a government that realises the imperative of budget repair to this nation's future economic prosperity, and we are committed to ensuring that all taxpayers contribute fairly. Now, there are some deductions that are simply inappropriate and are currently being used to game the system. For instance, travel that is essentially a leisure trip shouldn't be considered wholly tax deductible simply because on account of a single viewing of a potential investment property. To claim such a deduction is entirely inappropriate. It is often said, Acting Deputy President, the phrase used so often in this chamber is that it doesn't pass the pub test. And as such, the bills before the chamber tonight are the ones that go straight to the heart of addressing such abuses of tax deductions for residential property investment. The Australian Taxation Office has identified areas which constitute excessive and incorrect claims for travel expenses, and it now falls to the government to take a comprehensive and considered approach to clarifying and legislating rules around what actually constitutes excessive and incorrect claims, to spell out to both current and to potential residential real estate investors what is and is not an appropriate deduction. Now, by employing a comprehensive approach, as demonstrated in this bill, the government goes part of the way to meeting our budget night commitments to strengthen the residential investment property domain, as well as ensure a fairer tax system for all. So from July 1st, 2017, travel deductions for an individual investor with residential investment properties, including travel costs associated with inspecting and maintaining properties, will no longer be deductible. This denial of deductible status will limit the excessive and inappropriate claims and will send a very strong message that residential property investor status does not confer special privileges. The tax system is not there to pay for holidays. It's not there to pay for holidays by claiming travel costs as a rental expense. As the Assistant Minister to the Treasurer, the Honourable Michael Sukkar MP, outlined in his speech to the other place on the 7th of September this year, the existing law allows deductions for travel relating to income produced or gained from residential investment properties. When a property is used for a mixed purpose, such as a holiday home and a rental, or where the travel is for a mixed purpose, such as travelling to maintain an investment property and simultaneously go on a family holiday, travel expenses need to be split between income-producing and private purposes. The problem here has been widespread abuse around excessive travel expense claims relating to residential investment properties. And as a result of these changes, travel costs for individual investors inspecting and maintaining residential investment properties will no longer be deductible. Now, for the sake of clarity, Acting Deputy President, it's important to note that the government understands that third parties, such as real estate agents, may inevitably, from time to time, need to provide property management services. And of course, these activities will remain deductible expenses. These measures are in no way an assault on the nature of tax deduction expenses, which allow for a reasonable deduction of expenses incurred in earning accessible income. Acting Deputy President, inappropriate deductions also appropriately fall within the net of this legislation. Other inappropriate deductions also fall within the net of this legislation. Depreciation. Depreciation is another area of ambiguity that is potentially open to abuse. Now, the tax system currently creates opportunities for plant and equipment to be depreciated by not one but multiple owners of a property in excess of their actual value. So both previous and subsequent owners of a property can make deductions on the same pieces of plant and equipment. According to the Australian Taxation Office, Acting Deputy President, abuses of residential investment tax deductions for depreciation is actually very, very widespread. So the bill before the chamber tonight specifically targets plant and equipment depreciation deductions for investors of residential properties, limiting depreciation claims only to assets that have not been previously used. So that is assets not previously claimed upon by the previous purchaser. Acting Deputy President, depreciation is a very, very important accounting concept for residential investors, and claimed appropriately, it recognises the allocation of cost of an asset over its useful life. But in residential property investment, we must consider the use of such deductions on such things as dishwashers or air conditioning systems, claimed not once to their actual value, but well in excess of the asset's actual value by multiple successive owners of the same property. So you can see, Acting Deputy President, how changes proposed to deal with this interpretation of successive ownership and depreciation will actually improve the integrity of the tax system. Importantly too, however, and I think this is an extremely salient issue, this means that investors who have purchased a newly built residential investment property are not in fact disadvantaged when no other person has claimed a depreciation deduction. So while it may seem on face value to be a purely administrative amendment, I cannot overemphasise the importance of these measures, Acting Deputy President. The government knows that part of the equation to ease the burden of housing affordability is to encourage investment and growth in the market for new residential property, not existing but new residential property. And the measures in this bill, specified in this bill, ensure that deductions for assets in residential investment properties are consistently and fairly treated. Acting Deputy President, the other major component of these measures is the so-called ghost tax, where a penalty is raised on foreign owners of properties who leave their properties vacant. Now, I had no idea how common this was, but apparently in the latest census, 11.2% of households on census night were recorded as unoccupied. 11.2%, 1 in 10 properties. I find that quite extraordinary. That's more than 1 million dwellings. In a period of apparent housing crisis, such a statistic is indeed startling. So once again, the Turnbull Coalition government has listened to public concerns and is taking appropriate action. This year's budget papers announced, and I'm going to quote here, Acting Deputy President, to discourage foreign investors from buying residential properties and leaving these vacant, the government will now charge foreign owners of residential properties an annual charge if the property is not occupied or available to rent for at least 6 months in each year. Where a foreign-owned residential property is left vacant for more than 6 months in a year, a charge will be levied on the foreign owner, equivalent to the foreign investment application fee which was paid at the time of the application. The new charge builds on the government's existing foreign investment regime, which seeks to increase the number of houses available for Australians to live in. The charge provides a financial incentive for the foreign owner to make their property available on the rental market if they do not intend to reside there. So, Acting Deputy President, this regime, the ghost tax, will be ably administered by the ATO, by the Australian Tax Office, and is not only expected to increase the number of homes available to Australians who wish to rent, it is expected to generate revenue of over $20 million over the forward estimates. $20 million, that's a very significant contribution to budget repair. This is clearly a supply-side measure, and it will also effectively increase the available housing stock. Mr Acting Deputy President, the Turnbull Coalition government understands Australia's housing affordability issues. It has deep dived into this issue, and this is just one component of a suite of measures. Housing affordability is not something that has occurred overnight. It's occurred through a series of economic phenomenon and political decisions, many of which have been fundamental to the prosperity of our nation over many, many decades, but some of which have had unintended consequences. Australia's housing affordability issues are not something that can be fixed with easy answers, with a glib response, ill-considered or populist policy that will inevitably create a cure that potentially is far worse than the symptoms. It is also not a universal phenomenon. It is something that occurs far more in our capital cities, and in particular in Sydney and Melbourne. But it is not a nationwide issue. And no one has yet articulated what the objective of a successful housing affordability policy looks like. There is a reason for this, and the reason for this is that the answer is different to everyone on the continuum. And the continuum is what is so important here, Acting Deputy President. The continuum starts with homelessness, and it moves beyond homelessness to social housing, beyond social housing to first home buyers, on to investors, to downsizers, and eventually those moving into aged care. This is the spectrum of housing affordability. A successful housing affordability solution looks different to those in Sydney and Melbourne than to those in Adelaide or Hobart, and it looks very different to those in Shepparton or Moree. And while the answer is very different to everyone, it remains an important issue to thousands of Australians. The government is targeting the whole of the housing spectrum, and as the Federal Treasurer, the Honourable Scott Morrison, said in his budget address in May, there are no silver bullets to making housing more affordable, but by adopting a comprehensive approach, by working together, by understanding the spectrum of housing needs, we can make a difference. There is so much more to this issue than just a knee-jerk reaction of capital gains tax or negative gearing. There is so much more than just dealing with homelessness or just dealing with social housing or just dealing with first home buyers and the demand side of the equation. There are no silver bullets. Most importantly, there is no regional solution. There is no city-centric solution. It has to be a solution that covers the regional areas as well and covers things like decentralisation of services and infrastructure investment. These measures, Mr Acting Deputy President, these measures that have been outlined in the bill tonight go some way to this suite, to addressing the issue of housing affordability. It is one part of a much broader suite of policy objectives. So, Mr. President, Mr. Acting Deputy President, I can only implore my colleagues opposite. I can implore my colleagues opposite, and also to the crossbench. And I was very pleased to hear Senator Whish-Wilson's support for these measures tonight. I can only implore my colleagues opposite and those on the crossbench to support the legislation. Housing accessibility and affordability, as well as a fairer tax system, are truly important matters for this chamber to consider, and not just one issue, first home buyers, not just homelessness, not just social housing, not just downsizing. It's so important to address the whole spectrum of housing affordability issues. So I urge my colleagues opposite to consider this legislation seriously and support these changes that have been put to the chamber tonight. I thank the chamber for its time.
Thank you, Senator Hume. Senator Cameron.